Hello again. So we kicked off this evening by talking about Kate Atkinson's behind the scenes in the museum, and I suggested in that video that York itself was a kind of museum. But of course, York does have an actual city museum, York Castle Museum. And as the title of that museum suggests, it's inside York Castle. And York Castle was actually, for much of the 18th and 19th centuries, a prison, which brings me on to my next example. Bear with, here we go. So, one of the prisoners of York Castle Prison during the 1790s was a man named James Montgomery. And he wrote a collection of poems whilst in confinement called Prison and Amusements. And actually, as part of an ongoing project that I've been involved in for the last couple of years, all of the poems in this collection have been transcribed and are freely available to read online. I'll post a link on Twitter. Keep an eye on the hashtag Fictional York to see that if you'd like to read more of this poem and indeed other poems written by James Montgomery whilst he was in prison in the 18th century. So James Montgomery, if you haven't heard of him, was a newspaper editor based in Sheffield at the end of the 18th century. And he ran a newspaper called the Sheffield Iris. And this newspaper became quite well known at the time for criticising the government. James Montgomery, incidentally, went on to do various other things. He was briefly a romantic poet. He was the nation's most prolific hymn writer. He wrote Angels from the Realms of Glory. And he was director of the Sheffield Gas Company for 10 years and ultimately became a Tory MP. So he did all manner of different things. But in his adolescence, in his teenage years and in his 20s, he was something of radical. And that's what got him into trouble here. So in 1795, he was accused of printing a treasonous poem, and he was thrown into York Castle Prison, which incidentally is where a lot of politically radical and well-known protesters were confined at the end of the 18th century, particularly during the revolutionary 1790s. Crucially, though, during his trial, Montgomery's lawyer managed to prove that not only did Montgomery not write the poem in question, it had actually been written and printed 10 years earlier, so by somebody else, and written by somebody else and not printed whilst Montgomery was editor of the newspaper. But he was still thrown in jail. In his ironically titled two-part poem, The Pleasures of Imprisonment, Montgomery explains that as long as he had access to pen and paper, he could leave his body and go anywhere he liked. And he demonstrates this skill that he's got of sort of astral planing by going on an imaginary walk around York. And he explains as he does this, as he uses his imagination, his fellow prisoners become busy shoppers. The gatehouse becomes the minster. The prison clock becomes the clock above Coney Street. So here you have Montgomery going on this imaginary walk around a city, which I hope you're beginning to get a sense of during this reading group, a city which is already heavily bound up with the imaginary, even when you walk around it for real. So what happens when you go on an imaginary walk around a city that's already busy imagining itself? That's what this poem asks. So he's walking around this imagined version of York, and he's having a lovely time until he imagines himself arriving at the courthouse, which sits beside the prison. So his dream walk has actually led him back to where he really is. And upon refinding himself in his situation, the dream collapses, momentarily becoming a nightmare before the poem disintegrates just as the dream does. And that's what you have here in this quote. So he's arriving back at York Castle Prison in his imagined tour. Across the green, behold the court, where jargon reigns and wigs resort, where bloody tongues fight bloodless battles for life and death, for straws and rattles, where juries yawn their patience out and judges dream in spite of gout. There, on the outside door, as sang a wicked wag of yore, stands Mother Justice, tall and thin, who never yet hath ventured in. The cause, my friend, may soon be shown. The lady was a stepping stone, till, though the metamorphose odd is, a chisel made the block a goddess. Odd, did I say? I'm right, I'm wrong this time, but I'm hampered for rhyme. Justice at, I could tell you where, is just the same as justice here. When he's talking about Mother Justice there, incidentally, he's talking about the actual carved statue of the personification of justice that stands above York Castle Museum, which is still there today. You can sit on the grass, on the green he's describing here, and look up at the same statue that Montgomery was looking at then. But at this moment in the poem, The dream has become a nightmare. An encounter with the real, literal York has resulted in catastrophe. It's short circuited everything. Literature refuses to tolerate York as present, either physically or temporally. And that, I think, is what's happening at this moment in the poem. So feel free to ask any questions beneath this video about Montgomery or about this poem. As I say, I'll link to the full text on Twitter using hashtag Fictional York. And also, perhaps more importantly, tell us about whether you think York works well in literature as either an idealized dreamlike place or as perhaps a nightmarish and gothic place. We look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thanks very much for listening.